Boker Tov, everybody. Good morning, and thank you, Rabbi Feigenbaum, for coordinating, and thank you, Rabbi Spiro. Ken, great to have you on. What an honor! And last week we had our fill from Jewish history for the first part, leading up to the Babylonian era, and we're looking forward to continuing on this week. So please go ahead and continue on. And last week you said you're going to have a triple whiskey after your snafu, so we want to know about that triple whiskey as well. So please go ahead.
It was good. It was good. I have about 50 bottles of single malt sitting right next to me in case I need emergency treatment. Yeah. Last week, I apologize. It was very stressful. Thank God the power's on, the electricity's fixed. Presentation should be up and running good. So I'm going to, again, begin by we're doing another PowerPoint. Again, this is the first time this is being, you guys are seeing the first times each time premiere. I'm literally doing these. The classes are old, but the PowerPoints are new. One of the great, the silver lining of COVID-19 and Zoom classes is I've turned like everything I do into some sort of audio visual presentation now. So I'm going to, the host is disabled, participant screen sharing. Someone has to enable my screen sharing. Someone ought to do that. Do that.
Sorry, I just enabled that. Sorry, forgot.
Okay, great. No problemo. Let me find it right here. Actually, I want to see if I can do the advanced version this time. Let's see if we can use PowerPoint as a, hold on. Here we go. Let me see if we can find Purim in. Doing to me again. It's giving, for some reason, doesn't want to show me my other PowerPoints. In which case, we're just going to go back to the standard mode way of doing this. We'll just do normal. Here we go. Basic. Sorry about that. I don't know why it doesn't want to do this for you. There it is. Babylon and Persia and Purim. Here we are. Okay. Okay, let me just open this up. Is everyone seeing this? No problem? Yeah, we're good?
No, Ken, we still only see your, we don't see the PowerPoint yet. We just see the links to the PowerPoint.
Okay, let's try that once more. I don't have a problem with anyone else but you guys. Let's just try this once more. Okay, let's try this one now. Let's see if we can get. You seeing it now? You're seeing it?
We're good.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully that'll be the only glitch we have. Okay. So guys, for those of you who were with me last week, I'm going to do a quick review. There we go. Okay. Just make sure I'm not. There we go. Okay. Quick review. Yes. Here's our timeline we saw last week, just so we can zoom out before we zoom in. We dealt with this whole period of time of the First Temple period, 410 years of First Temple period, which is the national history of the Jewish people as recorded basically in the Book of Kings. And we get to Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroys the First Temple in 422 BCE. So that is where we left off. And we're now going to launch into move forward. Just a little bit of review, just to make sure we're all up on speed. Remember, we talked about last week, we had the united monarchy initially with the 12 tribes and under King David and King Solomon, and then afterwards a divided monarchy, and then going back about 2,700 years ago, the northern kingdom will go into exile, and about 2,500 years ago, the southern kingdom. Remember our king list, we went through all of these guys, kings of the north, kings of the south. I remember we focused on the notion of the spiritual decline of the Jewish people, of us not keeping our side of the bargain, and our contractual arrangement with the creator of the universe is what led to the tragic exile of first the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, first at the hands of the Assyrian Empire, and later at the hands of the Babylonian Empire. And we talked about, remember, the exile of the 10 tribes becoming the 10 lost tribes, slowly devoured by the expanding Assyrian Empire, and then appearing on the scene, which is where we're going to begin the next chapter of our Jewish history, is that Babylonian Empire, which will become the great world power, eventually expanding all the way down into Egypt and going back to 422 BCE. Remember, there's our final timeline for the last few decades of the kingdom of Judea in the south, but eventually being also gobbled up and destroyed during the reign of King Zedekiah after a 2.5-year siege. Jerusalem falls, the temple's destroyed, and we go into exile. Thus beginning for us a new and very difficult chapter in our history. I think I mentioned this last time, but today you guys are all living in diaspora, and diaspora can be very pleasant. That's the Greek word for scattering. But up until that time, for 840 years, we had lived in the land of Israel as a united people in one piece of real estate, our ancestral homeland, with Jerusalem as our capital city, to make the transition after traumatic destruction. It wasn't that we comfortably packed up our suitcases and moved on a nice airplane or a moving van, but to have our homes and our country destroyed and the temple destroyed proved to be physically and spiritually incredibly traumatic. I mentioned, remember, we talked about how 10 years before the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonians took the 10,000 best and brightest and the king at the time, Jehoiachin, to Babylon, which set the stage for the infrastructure for when all the Jewish people will arrive a decade later. There'll be Jewish infrastructure there waiting for them, which will prove to be quite advantageous. And here we are right at that line, our timeline, with Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon destroys the first temple, 422 BC. And now we're going to be looking at basically the miracle of Purim and the whole story of what takes place then. And not just Purim, but the whole discussion of how we managed to maintain our identity and survive in an environment that was completely new and different to us. This, by the way, this is the prophecy of Jeremiah prior to the destruction of the temple. He says, assuredly, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you would not listen to my words, I'm going to send all the people of the north, declares the Lord, and from my servants, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all those nations round about. I will exterminate them and make them a desolation, an object of hissing, ruins for all time. And I will banish them from the sounds of mirth and gladness, and the voice of the bridegroom and bride, and the sounds of the mill and the light of the lamp. This whole land shall be desolate ruin, and those nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. That's the whole reason I wanted to show you the quote, is a specific time frame we're given for our first experience with exile. It's a 70-year period. When the 70 years are over, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their sins, declares the Lord, and I will make it a desolation for all time. So we understand that this is divine retribution. God is using the Babylonians to punish us for our misbehavior. But it's not, God never gives up on us altogether. He says, I will remember you, and after 70 years of living in Babylon, I will bring you back, and I will punish those who punished you. And you can see, here's our little map. You can see of the various exiles. The purple is the 10 tribes of the north going into exile under the Assyrian Empire and being settled. You can see where they end up. And then you have the green is showing us where the Babylonians will exile the Jews to. And Babylon is a name of an empire, but it's also the name of a city. The city today corresponds to a city in Iraq called Hilla. And you can see it here right next to the Euphrates River in the lower right-hand corner, the same map. It's right over here where the black dot is. That is when we talk about the capital of the Babylonian Empire. That's where it's located today. Basically near the Euphrates, in between the Tigris and Euphrates River, at the center of the most fertile part of the country. And the Babylonians will build an incredible capital city. I mentioned before that the reason why they brought not just the Jews, but many other peoples to their capital city was they wanted to have a multicultural, like United Colors of Benetton empire, but with a capital city that took the best and brightest from everywhere, which proved to be very advantageous for them and very disastrous for everyone else. You can actually see here, this is a recreation of the capital city of Babylon. You see the ziggurat in the middle, those towers that they built in the middle, looks kind of like what you see in Mexico, in Teotihuacan. This is the Lion's Gate of the city of Babylon. And by the way, this gate was partially intact, was taken by the Germans to the Pergamon Museum and reconstructed using a lot of the materials and recreating their own materials. Here you can see it. This is the Ishtar Gate as it sits in Berlin today. And the people are about this big. If you want to see, you can see a person is a little small, about half the height of the door there. So it's a pretty impressive. It's all this beautiful ceramic, glazed ceramic tiles. You get a sense of how incredible the Babylonian Empire was. And this was the Lion's Gate, the Ishtar Gate, which is, by the way, where etymologically speaking, the heroine of our story, Esther, probably gets her name from, the goddess Ishtar, which I know sounds weird that a heroine of a Jewish story of monotheism should have a name from a Babylonian god, but that's what they say. All gods had female goddesses to go along with them. But here you can see the recreation. But I wanted to focus on, before we talk about the Purim story, is something that we don't appreciate, that the fact that we're here today is a byproduct of two phenomenon. One is, of course, a God who runs the world, who knows and controls everything and never gives up on his people. But we have to step back and appreciate what normative Judaism is supposed to be versus what we even have today, despite the fact that the diaspora is comfortable and we have a Jewish state back again. If you think about what normative Judaism is, what we're supposed to be, is all Jews living in the land of Israel. We have a king from the house of David. We have a Sanhedrin, have a whole court system with the Jewish Supreme Court at the top of that court system. We have a high priest from the family of Aaron. We have a temple in Jerusalem. We have a daily temple service, sacrifices, the whole thing. And we have yearly pilgrimage holidays, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. This is the core of Jewish identity, Jewish spiritual connection to God. If we go through a checklist, what of these things do we have today? The answer is zero. You talk about a normal human body has certain vital organs to it: 2 lungs, a heart with 4 ventricles, a big and small intestines, 2 kidneys, you got a brain. Certain of those things you can live without. I know a few people have donated a kidney. My older brother, unfortunately, has some digestive issues. He had to have part of his intestines removed, not to get too graphic. But you take out things like the heart, the brain, the person dies. So the question we have to ask ourselves, guys, is how is it that literally for thousands of years we have been living without the institutions of what is called normative Judaism, yet we are still here? And the answer is the ability of the Jewish people, and primarily those people who stepped in to take responsibility. I'm talking basically about the rabbis. Remember, Judaism is a system of checks and balances. You have an administrative branch, you have a king, you have a legislative, judicial branch, which is in America, it would be the Congress, the Senate, and the Supreme Court. In Israel, it's the Sanhedrin. And you have a priesthood. We're going to see that the kingship after the First Temple period is a non-existent entity. The priesthood, as we'll get to talking later, is a corrupted entity. We're going to talk about that in the next class when we talk about the Greeks and Hanukkah. The rabbis will have to take upon themselves a disproportionate role of responsibility. It's not really balanced the way it was supposed to be ideally, but it's a tremendous story of the judicial legislative body, the rabbis, stepping in and basically taking over and assuming responsibility, and not only keeping the Jewish people alive spiritually, which is essential for our physical survival. When Jews don't have Judaism, they don't die physically from lack of oxygen, but we assimilate out of existence. There's a great quote by Max Nordau, one of the early Zionist leaders. He said, more than the Jews kept the Sabbath kept the Jews. You could say the same thing about Torah in general. More than Torah, Jews kept Torah, Torah kept Jews. When Jews leave Torah behind, after a while, they're not Jewish anymore. We have to ask ourselves, how did we manage to survive? And in this specific instance, it falls onto the shoulders of the rabbis to keep the Jewish people going, and specific group of rabbis. If you look in the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah, which I'm sure many of you have learned, fantastic wisdom there. It begins by telling us what's called the Shalshelet Kabbalah, the chain of transmission. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, Umsala Yeshua. Moshe got the Torah from Sinai, gave it to Yeshua, and Joshua gave it to the elders, and the elders gave it to the prophets. And the Nevi'im, the prophets, gave it to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the great assembly. And these are the rabbi heroes of this whole period of time of Jewish history that are going to step in and assume an inordinate role of tremendous responsibility to ensure that despite the spiritual and physical dislocation and the trauma, the collective PTSD that we suffer from having our country destroyed, the temple destroyed, being strangers in a strange land, that we're going to be able to survive. The Anshe Knesset Gedolah, by the way, will be an expanded Jewish Supreme Court. Remember, the normal Sanhedrin it's 70, it's actually 71 judges to avoid a tie. They made it 71 judges who sat in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount in one of the areas, the rooms outside the temple itself. But the Anshe Knesset Gedola is an emergency expanded court, which is originally 120 judges. As they die off, they will not be replaced. So, but in total, it'll be 120. So by the time, and they'll be around from 310, which is about 12 years after the destruction of the first temple, to the early second temple period. If we kept reading in Pirkei Avot, it would tell you, I didn't put the whole quote up here, that Shimon HaTzadik, who we'll talk about in the next class, because he is the rabbi, high priest, Gadol Hador, last of the men of the Great Assembly, who gets to meet Alexander the Great. He is the last of the men of the Great Assembly, as we're told in the Ethics of the Fathers. So these 120 rabbis, just a little point of trivia, by the way, that the Israel's political governing body, Israel's parliament today, which is called the Knesset, has how many members? 120. And where do they get the number from? This tradition, the men of the Great Assembly. Although that's the only thing they probably have in common. They're certainly not on the same level. We're going to have elections coming up in a few weeks. Again, Israel now is the democracy that has had more elections in the last decade than any democracy in modern history. But we're not going to talk about that now. But the men of the Great Assembly played a very special role in Jewish history. First and foremost, their role was, as has been the role of all the rabbis throughout history, beginning with that whole chain of transmission we saw in the Ethics of the Fathers, the transmission, interpretation, and adaptation of the oral law. Not to do a whole class on this, but it's a fascinating topic, that because Jewish law is based on principles that are absolute, they can be applied at any different period of time. Understanding the principle of striking a fire is what's applied in the mid-20th century by rabbis to decide whether you can start a car. But as technology changes and the geopolitical realities and our circumstances have changed, halacha is very, very fluid and flexible within certain red lines, and is able to be adapted. And certainly this has happened at all periods of time. Anyone who thinks that we are keeping the same kind of Judaism, I'm not talking about we didn't eat pork back then and we eat it now, kind of thing like that. Not talking about that stuff. Anyone thinks that Judaism of today is identical to the Judaism of thousands of years ago doesn't understand how much has to be adapted and changed due to changing circumstances, changing technology, and so forth. And the men of the Great Assembly had a specifically tough job of having to adapt Judaism and replace much of what was normative Judaism with all kinds of things to take the place of what we couldn't do anymore. And they did a lot of that stuff. Number two is the canonization of the written law. When I say canonization of the written law, they will seal what will be included in the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible, which we know as the word Tanakh, which is an acronym for the 5 books of Torah, that's the Ta, in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the 8 books of the prophets, of which the last book has 12 minor prophets in it. It's called Treasar. So there's a couple of like minor prophets that they're all combined into one book. And the Ketuvim, the 11 books of the writing. So put that together, you get the word Tanakh, 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. Again, just a small technical point, because medieval publishers in the 15th century, non-Jews, divided some of our books up. If you count them today, there's 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, things like that. But and originally they're considered to be one book each in terms of our accounting over here. So the men of the Great Assembly will close the Hebrew Bible. They will say, this is what are holy books of the Jewish people. There were certainly books that were left out. There could have been things written by other prophets that were left out. The criteria had to be a book written by a prophet and have a message that was relevant to us today, until today, which is good. Whenever you're reading any part of the Hebrew Bible, you should be asking, if it's in there, it's written by a prophet and it's relevant to me, so what am I supposed to learn from it? And the last thing was that they formalized prayer. And formalizing prayer was a very important thing, because it's part of a whole process they did of Zecher LeMikdash, of how do you keep people remembering what normative Judaism is about, temple service and things like that, and how do you keep people spiritually connected? Because when the temple was around, you did not have formalized prayer. You had Kohanim serving in rotation in the temple, and you had Mamadot Yisrael. I live on a street right outside my window here. It's called Mamadot Yisrael Street. Jews took turns, like rotating through. Jews would come to Jerusalem from all around the country and be representatives of the Jewish people to be on the temple in Jerusalem when the service was being done. But you didn't have formalized prayer 3 times a day, which means a loss of spiritual connection. because that's what the temple is about. God, you felt God really literally emanating out of Jerusalem, out of the temple, and a loss of remembering what normal Judaism is about, which is why the Talmud in Tractate Brachot discusses, that prayer is a substitution for temple service, even the names of the services, like Musaf and things like that. So that was the three big accomplishments of this incredible institution. And we see in hindsight, they were around for 100 years, but they were able to create a portable version of Judaism, which enabled us in our first diaspora experience, our first experience scattered outside the land of Israel, to stay together spiritually and cohesively as a community and connected to Judaism. Those Jews that remained in the land of Israel or went elsewhere did not have that infrastructure. And as we get later into Jewish history, we'll see when the Jews return, like when Ezra, they find that those Jews had basically lost it because they didn't have the spiritual infrastructure to keep them going. Okay, another institution that was created at the time is called the Reish Galusa, which is an Aramaic word. Remember the language of Babylon, which is the spoken language of the Second Temple period, even in the land of Israel, was Aramaic. The script we use today is not the Proto-Hebraic script of the First Temple period. It's the script we brought back from. It's called Ashurit, Assyrian script. Remember, like alphabets, like the English alphabet you're looking at in this image here, can be used to write numerous languages: French, Spanish, English, Italian, Portuguese. So too, the script can be used for other languages. But Reish Galusa is Rosh Galut, the head of the diaspora. And the correct term would be an exilarch. Starting with Yehonia, who we saw previously, was the second to last king who was deposed after 3 months by the Babylonians and brought with the 10,000 best and brightest a decade before the destruction of Jerusalem. They were brought down. He is the first of these people for a period of time from the 5th century BCE to the 10th century CE, almost 1,500 years, in what is originally the Babylonian Empire, later the Persian Empire, the Sassanian Persian Empire, all the way up through the early medieval period. There will be a little bit of debate. I put 47 individuals, about 47 different individuals. Each and every one of them will be a direct descendant of the royal bloodline of the kings of Judah, from King David's family. And their purpose will be not to be the chief governor of the Jewish people, but to be the representative, a way of preserving the Davidic bloodline, which, by the way, in the Second Temple period, the Nasi, the prince of the Sanhedrin, will also, people like Hillel, will in the land of Israel will have that same function. They will be one of the co-leaders of this Jewish Supreme Court in the land of Israel, and they will be direct descendants of King David's family. As I said, Hillel was himself. But these different Reish Galusa people will be the sort of temporal, the leader of the Jewish community and the representative of the Jewish community to the non-Jewish authorities, be they Babylonian or Persian. It's a very interesting institution that will exist, again, for almost 1,500 years. Some of them will be very great people. Some of them will be very bad people. As a matter of fact, the founding, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but the founding of one of the early offshoots of Judaism called the Karayim, will probably be founded in the 9th century by a guy by the name of Anan ben David, like that, who was bypassed to be the Reish Galusa. He was from the Davidic line, and out of being really upset with him not being chosen for the job, will break off from mainstream Judaism and create his own version of the religion, which will become quite powerful, impactful, and even damaging to the Jewish people. But you have these institutions put into place. You're going to have the Men of the Great Assembly and the Reish Galusa, so you have solid political, spiritual, legal Jewish infrastructure set up there, which is going to be very beneficial for the Jewish people, enabling us to maintain our own, private affairs within the Babylonian administration, govern ourselves. I want to run through a little chronology now of the events that are going to take place and get us up to the story of Purim. So 422 BC, Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. We talked about that. 421 BC, Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, Daniel was one of the 10,000 best and brightest, who, along with Hananiah, Misha, and Azariah, and along with Mordechai, the hero of our story, who were taken, remember, they brought the best down to Babylon, and groomed by the Babylonian authorities for leadership positions. He will prove himself. Daniel is a fascinating story, by the way. He is very similar to Joseph in his ability to interpret dreams and his meteoric rise to power. He doesn't become the viceroy of Egypt, but becomes one of the chief advisors to Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, who has a dream, very similar parallel plot to the Joseph story, that he's extremely troubled by, and none of his necromancers and astrologers and dream interpreters can interpret. And he will interpret the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar will elevate him to a position of tremendous power as one of his chief advisors. After Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor of Babylon, is gone, the next emperor will be Evil Marudach, who is the next emperor of Babylon, often misread as Evil Marduk. But he's the next Babylonian emperor. And remember, the Jews are comfortably living ensconced in Babylon. After him will come, only a few years later, will be Belshazzar, the emperor of Babylon. Now, Belshazzar, remember, we saw Jeremiah's prophecy of 70 years. The Babylonians had pillaged Jerusalem. They'd taken vessels from the temple. Ark, we're not sure of. The Ark's a big debate. The Talmud talks about what happened to the Ark. There's two opinions. That one is that it was hidden by one of the earlier kings, maybe Yoshiyahu. Josiah hid it somewhere secretly. I think it's actually hidden somewhere in the environs of the old city. Another opinion is they took it down to Babylon, but they took all the super cool stuff, King Solomon's throne, and all the holy vessels of the temple. But Jewish tradition tells us they were afraid to mess with it because they were afraid to mess with the Jewish God. They had their own gods, but they knew the Jewish God was a powerful guy. So they're counting when is the 70 years of Jeremiah's prophecy going to be up? Is God going to keep his word? So basically, Belshazzar, everyone should remember to please mute their microphones. It's unmuted, so we're hearing some noise in the background. Belshazzar miscalculates, and he whips out the vessels of the temple and has a big party with them. Like, I don't know what he's taking out, the priestly garments, he's wearing them. And that leads to a disaster for Belshazzar, because that night a disembodied hand appears on the wall. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is 375 becomes emperor. 372 is in the middle of this feast, a disembodied hand appears on the wall. You ever heard the expressions? Most of the best idioms in the English language come from two places, the Bible and Shakespeare. But you know the expression, he didn't see the writing on the wall? That's exactly, you can see it's a famous Rembrandt painting. There's so many Rembrandt paintings. Rembrandt was obsessed with Jews, both when he was living in Holland, the local Jews living in Holland, but also Bible stories. And you can see his painting of the picture of this disembodied hand writing a message encoded. And he's trying to read it from right to left, and he can't interpret it. And you can see everyone shocked. There's like a hand writing, like floating in the air and writing this message. And they call in Daniel. Remember, Daniel was working for Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's working for Belshazzar. And Daniel interprets this in the book of Daniel, chapter 5. He reads the encoded message. You got to read it looking from up to down. Mana, mana, takel. You can see it down. Look at read it. He says, this is the writing that is inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, ufarsin. And this is the meaning. Mem, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the balance and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And we say that night, a Median-Persian alliance will do a sneak attack at night and overthrow the Babylonian Empire. And Belshazzar is killed. And now the Persians and the Babylonians are going to rule. By the way, the first king is Darius the Mede, and Daniel goes to work for him. That's the famous story of when a decree is issued that no one's allowed to pray to any gods. And Daniel goes against it, similar to what Mordechai will do later, and openly prays 3 times a day to the God of Israel, and he's thrown in the lion's den. That's the famous story in the book of Daniel. It's such an interesting book, the book of Daniel. First of all, a lot of it is in Aramaic. The first part of it is pretty much straight historical narrative, and then the rest of it is dealing with these wild, super cool dreams, one of which was the dream that I showed you previous class of the 4 different animals that represent the 4 empires. But this is from the famous when Daniel's thrown into the den of lions and sealed in there. And next day, Darius was really upset because he really likes Daniel, finds him alive again. And they're very impressed by that. Anyway, So we have Darius to meet his emperor in 372. Daniel interprets the writing on the wall. Daniel in the lion's den. And in 371 BCE, Cyrus, Koresh of Persia, emperor. He becomes emperor. So they're alternating, sort of what was supposed to happen in Israel with Netanyahu and Gantz. We're going to have an election soon. It's not going to happen, but Netanyahu was supposed to step down after like a year and a half or something, and Gantz was supposed to become the prime minister. But in this case, Cyrus, the emperor of Persia, is going to reverse the Babylonian policy of bringing all the peoples of the world into Babylon, and he's going to actually send them home. And it says here, Cyrus of Persia, emperor, decree of return. Zerubbabel returns with 42,000 Jews. Zerubbabel, by the way, is the third Reish Galusa. And we'll get to that story in a minute, but I want to show you here, this is in the book of Ezra, a very important character at this period of time. Here you can see the cylinder. This is in the British Museum. The British have pillaged a lot of stuff from the ancient Near East. And you can see it's called a cuneiform cylinder. This is wedge shape, which is Greek word cuneiform. They make wedge shape marking. It's a phonetic language. That you can see by making these wedges into the cuneiform tablets, this cuneiform cylinder. This is Cyrus's decree. And here is a parallel version of the decree recorded in the book of Ezra. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, when the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah was fulfilled, the Lord roused the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia to issue a proclamation throughout his realm by word of mouth and in writing as follows. Thus said King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is Judah. Any one of you, of all of his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, that is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord, God of Israel, the God that is in Jerusalem. So Cyrus basically reverses the policy and says, you can go home, Jews go home. Everyone can go home, not just the Jews. What's interesting is on this cylinder you can see here, and it's actually pretty good size. It's like this. There's no mention of specifically Jews going back to the land of Israel, but it's a parallel story. But we see that it fits into exactly what was the policy of Cyrus, the emperor of Persia. So the Jews return. Zerubbabel returns with 42,000 Jews, and they begin the reconstruction 52 years after destruction of the temple. It begins. Let me actually go back up here for a second. I want to focus on. It's interesting, by the way, that I estimate that there was maybe 1.5 million Jews living in the Babylonian Empire at the time, and 42,000 go back. Why did more Jews go back? And again, like I say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. When Israel was founded as a state in 1948, there were 11 million Jews left post-Holocaust, and there were 600,000 Jews in the land of Israel. What percentage of 1.5 million is 42,000? It works out to about 5%. And it's about the same number of Jews come back to Israel in 1948, the same 5%. And the question is why? You know, Israel's given back to us after half a century. Why not everyone go back? And the answer is in 1948, if you'd come to Israel, it was not a great place to live in. I mean, spiritually fantastic, but no infrastructure and a constant state of warfare. You know, it was a real third world place. Everything was being rationed. It was not a place. You're going to come from like, you know, Paris or, you know, America, you have all this plenty, to like this desert with no infrastructure. Even when I got here in 82, there was like one kind of toilet paper. It was really bad. There was one kind of ice cream, really bad chocolate. You know, the wine was terrible. The exile is comfortable. The exile is comfortable. The exile doesn't remain comfortable, which is the story of Purim we're going to get to in a minute. But initially, the exile was comfortable. And so only a small number of the Jews come back, but they start to rebuild the temple. The problem is that when they start to rebuild the temple, the Samaritans, who I mentioned in the last class, remember the Assyrians, when they exiled the 10 tribes in the north, they took the Jews out and they put someone else in to pacify some other people they didn't like. They moved them into our territory. Remember the Samaritans, because they're getting eaten by the animals, because the land of Israel wasn't tolerating foreign sojourners, did like tried to do a quickie, insincere conversion to Judaism. They weren't accepted by us and they hated us. And they're always going after us. When we get to the story of Alexander the Great in the next class, they're still trying to get rid of us. So the Kutim, as they're called, the Samaritans, they send a letter to Cyrus saying, these Jews, you know, they only rebelled the first time under the Babylonians because of that temple. They thought their God was going to protect them. You let them build that temple again, it's going to be bad news. They're going to rebel again. So Cyrus will freeze the construction of the temple for 18 years. It's going to be 18 years. It's going to be frozen. And that is basically when the story of Purim is now going to kick in. The two things dropped down at once. Okay, I apologize. But after Cyrus, we're going to have Ahasuerus becomes the emperor. Now remember, Ahasuerus was not descended from royalty. Just like the Shah of Iran, who was deposed in 1979. The real bloodline of the royal family of Iran is something totally different. His father was a corporal in the Iranian army in World War I, in the Persian army. He was a usurper. And people who usurp who aren't legitimately royal often have to compensate with big egos and doing all kinds of crazy stuff and having very sensitive. So he's really a no one with no background. To get, by the way, legitimacy, he will marry the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, whose name is Vashti. Now, imagine what the Babylonians viewed themselves, and these emperors viewed themselves as being descendant of gods. And she's married to a commoner, even if he's thinking he's the emperor. Come on, she probably does not have a lot of respect for him. And he's kind of a bumbling fool. He's not made out to be the most, not an evil guy, but certainly at best incompetent. Remember how the story goes. And remember this story, and then we read the Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, which is only a few chapters. It seems to happen very quickly, but it's actually going to be happening over a period of 14 years. The story. So first of all, in 369, which is easy to remember because the goose drank wine, Ahasuerus becomes emperor. 3 years later, he miscalculates again, like Belshazzar did, and he has a big banquet with the vessels from the temple. He's probably wearing the Kohen Gadol's outfit and everything. Who knows what he's doing? He invites the Jews who show up, and they're glatt kosher catering. This is not like, totally assimilated Jews here. They show up to the big party. I mean, it wasn't a party specifically to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't think, but he's still not doing the good stuff there. So you could see this is not good for the Jewish people. Meanwhile, he demands that Vashti appear naked in front of his guests. Apparently, if you want to get the inside story on this, you got to learn Tractate Megillah in the Babylonian Talmud. It gives a lot of really cool insights. Apparently she was a pretty immodest person who wouldn't have minded doing it, except that she had all kinds of like sores all on her body and everything. God had struck her with many horrible things, and she did not want to appear looking unattractive, albeit with no clothing. So she refuses, and the impetuous, evil Ahasuerus has her killed. Again, we see being impetuous in this story leads to a lot of disasters for our enemies, both Ahasuerus and Haman in the narrative. And a good lesson in life in general is never make important decisions hastily. And now he is queenless, and oh, there it is. I just already did here. Okay, hadn't had time to go through the PowerPoint and check everything's correct. Everything in yellow here is what's taking place in the Purim narrative. 369, Ahasuerus the emperor holds banquet, Vashti is executed. Okay, the next, and you can see here, the beginning of the Megillat Esther and it happened in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. This was the whole known world at the time that wasn't Asia. And by the way, unlike in the Holocaust, when even at Hitler, had he taken Russia and gotten all the Jews that were there, he got a lot of them. He got, of the 11 million Jews living in Europe and the Soviet Union, he got 6 million. There still would have been Jews living in America and Canada and South America. Here, all the Jews in the world are living in the 127 provinces of the Persian Empire. In those days, when King Ahasuerus occupied the royal throne in the fortress in Shushan, which is the city of Hamadan of today, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all the officials and courtiers and the administration of Persian Media, the nobles and the governors in the provinces in his service. And that is setting the stage at the beginning of this 14-year story for the whole Purim narrative. Okay, so the next thing that happens in our timeline is fast forwarding to 357. This is when 362, excuse me, Esther is chosen as queen. That's a pretty wild story. Let's go back to that. Sorry. Esther is chosen as queen. Remember, he is queenless and he needs to find a queen. And he goes and he checks out like every woman between certain ages in the entire empire. And of all the women he chooses Esther. Esther is the niece, and according to the Talmud, married to Mordechai. Mordechai was one of the men of the Great Assembly, one of the young men brought down to Israel down from Israel a decade before the destruction to Babylon, and he's the Gadol Hador. So of all the women to pick as a wife, this is the one. Anyway, she finds favor in Ahasuerus' eyes. He brings her to the palace. She becomes the queen. She hides her identity. Now, I'm just going to run through the narrative faster because I know you guys know the stories well, and I want to get to just the lessons at the end that we can learn and apply to history. But there's such cool plot and twists in the plot of the story. The only plot that's better than this is the Joseph narrative and the cliffhangers and going back and forth until all the stories come together in the Joseph narrative. You see it happening here in the exact same way. So Esther is chosen as queen. She hides her identity. Meanwhile, we know that Ahasuerus will elevate to power a man by the name of Haman Ha'agagi. I hate him so much I didn't put his name in the timeline over here. Now, Haman Agagi is an interesting story because we know Haman Agagi, who's Agag? Agag in our narrative is there's a king called Agag. If we rewind to the book of Samuel, we see that when Samuel anoints Saul king, he gives him to fulfill one of the commandments that you're supposed to fulfill when you come to the land of Israel. One is to appoint a king, which Samuel does. Two is to build a temple, or actually two is to wipe out the Amalekites, the arch enemy of the Jewish people, the absolute hyper uber Nazis who hate Jews with such a passion. They hate God and they hate the Jewish people, that whenever they're in a position to do so, they will go after us with a vengeance, with no mercy whatsoever. Samuel tells Saul to get rid of the Amalekites. God has handed them over to you. And don't be merciful to them. You know, God says, I'm God. I'm as merciful as you get. They are my children also. If I say you get rid of them, you get rid of them. If you don't, boy, bad news. And we know that Saul wins a big battle, but spares King Agag long enough for his bloodline to survive. And that's exactly what unfortunately happens. And we see Agag's descendant will be Haman and give an Amalekite a chance to come to power, which is what he does. And he immediately comes to power and immediately badmouths us, as all the anti-Semites do. He tells the king, he doesn't know that his queen is a Jew, that there's a nation amongst you. They're not loyal. They're different from us. And here, take this massive bribe of a few $1 billion and hand him over to me, because that's Amalek. If he has a button that he could press, nuke the world, I go, but I take the Jews with me. I'm going to do it. He'll spare no effort and no sacrifice and no fortune to get the Jews. And they start throwing these lots, because these guys are serious pagans. They don't do things randomly. They start throwing the dice. That's where the Purim comes from. And when is this happening, by the way? This is happening just before Nisan, just before Passover. And they're throwing the dice to see what's an auspicious month to kill the Jews off. And 1 month goes by, 2 months, and 3 months, not good, not good. Roll dice again, roll dice again, roll dice again. Comes out 11 months later. This is what you miss in the story unless you're paying really careful attention to the text and writing down the dates and figuring it out. 11 months later, which is going to be Adar, the end of the year. Nisan's the beginning of the calendar. That's the month to kill the Jews. And they send out all these letters to all the nations around in the empire that on this and such a date, you can slaughter every single Jew, man, woman, and child, and steal all their property. And all the Jews are freaking out. And by the way, it's a great example. All the anti-Semites are coming out of the woodwork, counting the months and making, like this thing, we're going to kill you guys in 11 months, that kind of thing. Which actually works out to be very advantageous. Very stressful at the time, but we'll see very advantageous later. And we know that therefore, and then what happens? Meanwhile, remember, Haman is, he's all like he's making a gallows to hang Mordechai. He's being very impulsive. Can't wait. And meanwhile, Esther's in the palace. She doesn't have a smartphone. Even if she did, the reception probably isn't too good there. She doesn't know what's going on in the kingdom, and all the Jews are freaking out and all the tumult going on. Meanwhile, her husband, Mordechai, gets word to her of what's going on. And she says, you got to do something. And she says, what can I do if I go into the palace without being summoned? I'm going to get killed. And Mordechai is like, what? And out of his mouth comes one of the greatest lines in the entire Bible, in my opinion. He says, in terms of taking responsibility, he says, salvation is going to come to the Jews from somewhere else, but you and your family are going to be lost. And who knows, he says, maybe this is why you're in the palace in the first place. That could be the biggest duh line in the entire Bible. But he says this, you're there for a reason. Clearly, God runs the world. You got to do something. And then she says, okay, lech mosot kol Yudim, go unify the Jewish people. And he got all fast. Remember in Judaism, this is the huge thing. You don't rely on miracles. You got to pray, you got to do tshuva, and you got to act. And she fasts for 3 days, which is really kind of scary, kind of life-threatening. And she goes in. When does she go in? On the 15th of Nisan, which is Passover. The Jews forget having a Seder. Everyone's fasting. And we know what happens in the story, right? The whole thing is flipped over. Remember, she invites the Haman to the wine feast with her husband, the emperor, twice in a row. That she reveals second time around when she's got him all liquored up and feeling really good about her. He says, spare my life. Ish sar oyev, he's trying to kill me. And the whole thing gets flipped over. Unbelievable. Just as everything seemed like we're backed into a corner, boom, flipped over. Vanafachu, and Haman is hung on the gallows he makes for Mordechai. The decree of killing the Jews can't be rescinded, but now we know who all our enemies are. And now Mordechai gets the emperor to issue his own set of new decrees that you can kill all your enemies, Jews. And we know exactly who our enemies are. And the Jews go, and this is again, almost a year later, at the time of Purim, which would be next week, the Jews rise up in a preemptive strike like 1967. Before they can launch their attack, we launch ours, and we trash our enemies. And Haman's family, Haman's family is killed, and we win a big victory, and we get to loot their property, but we don't, we give it to the king, whatever. The whole thing is flipped over. And then a year later, after the smoke is cleared, where Jews are victorious and our enemies are dead, then the men of the Great Assembly, looking back, they say, whoa, this was supernatural. This is God's hand. You, Esther, are a prophetess. We're going to include this book, which is one of the later books of the Bible, in the Bible. It's a holy book, and the message is relevant. And we're going to make this a holiday for the Jewish people. So we see the whole thing is flipped over, but to focus on some of the lessons, because it's not just about going through the chronology and seeing where it fits into Jewish history, very end of the exile, beginning of the Second Temple period. There's some lessons we got to focus on from Purim that are relevant throughout all of Jewish history. Number one, which is totally relevant, is that the greatest explosions of anti-Semitism often come from places where we're seemingly most comfortable. One of the big problems, and the reason why this all happened in the first place, is we're getting too comfortable. And when we get too comfortable, even if we're still connected to Torah, we forget what we're supposed to be and what we're supposed to be doing as a nation. And this will happen in Purim. This happened in Egypt. This happened in Spain before the expulsion. It happened in Germany before the Holocaust. We have to always be aware that the only place we're meant to be long-term is back in the land of Israel. Number two, which is brought down in the Midrash Tanchuma and Parshat Metzora and Yalkut Shmoni, it talks about one who becomes compassionate to the cruel, ultimately be cruel to the compassionate. We see that Saul's misplaced mercy on Agag will lead him survive long enough to have his seed survive, and another Amalekite descendant of his will come into power and will immediately decree to slaughter us. If we have enemies, we have to deal with them. I'm not saying today we don't live in a time when we have prophets and kings and a Sanhedrin telling us to wipe other people out, but when you have that connection and a prophet tells you to do it, and we know it's a commandment, you have a Sanhedrin, you do this stuff. By the way, David sparing Shimi ben Gera when there was a famous story in the book of Samuel when his son Avshalom rises up against him and he's fleeing for his life up the Mount of Olives, and Shimi ben Gera, a descendant of King Saul, is cursing David because in his mind he usurped the throne from Saul's family, and he's throwing rocks at him. And Yoab ben Surya, David's general who loved killing everyone, says, he curses the king, let me take his head off his shoulders. And David says, no, not now. David's a prophet. He says, let him live. When David's about to die, he tells his son Solomon, you put Shimi ben Gera on probation, he'll violate it, and then you could kill him. But he's got to stick around. There's something good is going to come out of him. And what comes out of him is Mordechai, who's described as a Benjamite. A Benjamin, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. He's a direct descendant of Shimi ben Gera. So David's properly placed mercy will allow something good to come out of a bad person, Shimi ben Gera, who will be the anecdote. Isn't that cool? Think how everything comes together centuries later. He'll be the anecdote to the evil that was not destroyed by allowing a descendant of Amalek to survive. So that's a huge lesson we learn in general. It's very applicable. We have to know when to be merciful at the right time. We have to know when to stand up to evil and if necessary to destroy it. Okay, what happened here? Okay. Oh, here it is. We're going to end the story. The same day on which the Jews enjoyed relief from their foes, and the same month, I just want to focus on this quote. This is the very end of the Megillah, to focus on the last couple lessons we're supposed to learn. Because this is what we really learned from the story of Purim. It says, which had been transformed, and the word is nehefach, v'nafachu. Okay, it's the theme of the day. From one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. They were to observe them as days of feasting and merrymaking, as an occasion for the sending of gifts one another to the present and presents to the poor. The Jews accordingly assumed as an obligation that which they had begun to practice and which Mordechai prescribed for them. For Haman, the son of the Hamadatta, the Agagite, the foe of all the Jews, had plotted to destroy the Jews and had cast pur, which is these lots, the dice, that is the lots, with intent to crush and exterminate them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded, with promulgation of decrees, let the evil plot which he devised against the Jews recoil on its own head. It's going to go back on itself. So they impaled him and his sons on the stake. Pretty heavy stuff. For that reason, these days were named Purim, after the Pur. In view then of all the instructions in the said letters, and of what they had experienced in the matter and what had befallen them. And it says, and the Jews undertook irrevocably obligated themselves and their descendants and all who might join them to observe these days in the manner prescribed and in the proper time each year. And that's the last thing I wanted to focus on, the ideas of v'nafachu. In the story, we see that God's name doesn't appear in the book, but his hand is visible everywhere. It's one of two books in the Bible that God's name doesn't appear in, which is the second book is Song of Songs, which is on a superficial level a love poem between a man and a woman, but a deeper level a love poem between God and the Jewish people, and has many deep, profound understandings. But we have to appreciate that in the Second Temple period, with prophecy disappearing, and us being on a lower level of spirituality, we don't get open miracles. Everything happens, as we say, derech hateva. But when in hindsight, we see that God's hand may not be visible openly, like the splitting of the sea we saw leaving Egypt, but that it's very clear that God is behind the scenes manipulating what seems to be happenstance, which is the name of the holiday, Pur, luck. Amalek stood for there's no God who acts in history. Yet everything about the holiday, which seems to be even the name of the holiday based on chance, was, in hindsight, we see was a series of seeming coincidences which worked their way out to make everything work out exactly the way it's flipped over, v'nafachu. And we have to remember that there are no accidents. And just as we see in that story, we have to recognize constantly that in the current events in the news that unfolds before our eyes today, that God is always acting behind the scenes, the invisible hand, setting the stage for what will happen next. And that's another reason why when we keep Purim, the whole idea of wearing costumes or getting drunk or sleeping, depending upon whose opinion you hold by. When you're unconscious because you're asleep, or when you're unconscious because you're drunk, you're not in control, but God is always in control. That's the great demonstration of what the holiday of Purim is ultimately about. And that seeing God's hand in the world today is not easy, but it's very rewarding. The rabbis say that Yom Kippur, which is like the heaviest day of the year, which is a day when there's no feasting and partying, but it's all fasting, is Kippurim, is like Purim, implying that Purim, which is a rabbinic holiday, it's not even in the Torah, and it's not one of the holidays mentioned in the 5 books of Moses, is on a higher level. On Yom Kippur, the original Yom Kippur, we're told that what happened historically is Moses comes down the mountain the second time with the second set of tablets after the golden calf, and the Jewish people accept the Torah. The rabbis say that he held the mountain over us. God holds the mountain over us and says, accept the Torah or I drop the mountain on you. It's not a literal midrash. We're being told in that story is when you just stood at Mount Sinai and you had the greatest experience of reality humanly possible, which is national revelation and hearing God speak. And God then says, you want my Torah? What are you going to do? Think about it? I'm not sure you're even there. I'm not sure the Torah is from you. There's no free will in that. Your free will is almost gone in that decision-making process. But Kippurim, Purim is the exact opposite. It's a holiday that's a-rabbinic, takes place outside the land of Israel. It's very little spirituality in the day in terms of like, we don't spend all day studying, and you read the Megillah, you do pray, but it's a lot of feasting and partying. It's the antithesis in every way, yet exactly the antithesis in terms of experiencing God. In Purim, it's a lot more work in that story to see God. In hidden hand of God in the story. It's a lot more work, but as the rabbis say in the Ethics of the Fathers, lafun sar agra, according to the pain is the reward. And that's the struggle we have until today, is recognizing that we have to constantly be working on seeing God's hand in history and staying connected in an environment where God is hidden behind the veil, which is even where the term Esther comes from. The rabbis in the Talmud ask, where does Esther mention in the 5 books of Moses? And in the book of Deuteronomy, God says, Astir astir panav, I will surely hide my face. Hester panim, that God's face, and from the Second Temple period onward, including today, is hidden behind the veil. The word olam, which also means the word world, means to be hidden. Something that's ne'elam, is disappeared. So God is hidden, but he's always there. And we have to try and see him behind the curtain, behind the veil, and stay connected despite the challenge. And of course, very important is the notion of Jewish unity is crucial to our survival and accomplishing our mission. We're only able to get that salvation when Esther says, gather Jewish people together and let's fast. And then once we finish fasting and we get the salvation, then we're going to fight together against our enemies. And these are all lessons that are so powerful. And it's such an amazing story. And it's such a crucial period of time in Jewish history. By the way, here you can see the tomb of Mordechai and Esther in Hamadan, which is biblical Shushan. You can see the Muslims have turned it into an Islamic site today. I can't vouch for 100% this is the correct site, but traditionally this is where the Persian Jewish community has always said it is. And you can see that's the outside of the building, and there's the inside of the building with the two grave sites, the two burial monuments on top. And just to get to the last little thing here as we come to the end here, 352, the temple is completed. This is after the Purim miracle, 355. Work restarts on the temple under the Persian Emperor Darius, who, if could be Esther's son. That's not clearly communicated, but he's the next emperor, the descendant of that emperor, Ahasuerus. And 348, Ezra comes to Israel, spiritual reawakening to rejuvenate the Jewish people and get the Jews who had stayed in Israel back into Judaism. 347, the Jewish people, it's a famous recommitment to the Torah that Ezra is able to get the Jewish people to strengthen themselves. So the temple's rebuilt, the Jewish community of Israel strengthened. In 335 BCE, Nehemiah will return. He had already been in Israel and gone back again. He comes back again, rebuilds the walls. So now we're in solidly into the beginning of the Second Temple period with Jerusalem rebuilt, albeit a very small city, a small, inexpensive temple rebuilt, a small Jewish community, but behind solid walls. And this will be the start of that next period of 420 years of the Second Temple period, in which Jerusalem will reach the height of its glory prior to destruction, being the largest city in the Eastern Roman Empire, and the temple in Jerusalem being reconstructed to be the largest functioning religious site on the planet Earth. So we left off there, and we're going to pick up the next class. We're going to continue with Alexander the Great and the Greeks and the Hanukkah narrative, but that is actually chronologically the next period of time after the first 36 years of the Second Temple period, which are the Persian control of the land of Israel. So thank you for joining me in that whirlwind tour. Again, you're welcome to go to my website. I got tons of content online there for free, and you're welcome to contact me through the website or sending me an email through kenspiro@gmail.com. I would love to hear feedback, and if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Everyone should enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see you, I think it's after Purim, I believe. So everyone should have
thank you. First of all, again, a big thank you to Ken Spiro for, again, a very informative his history of that era. Yes, the next class will be March 4th and March 7th. So the next two are March 4th and March 7th. Again, the same Zoom link, so no need to re-sign up or anything like that. Feel free to share it with your friends. And if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and unmute yourselves. Feel free to.
Absolutely. Yeah. Questions, comments?
Okay, Bonnie, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Hi. Thank you, Rabbi Spiro. This was great, as usual. We make such a big deal of